Bob Dylan stopped mid-song. He lowered his guitar. And he looked toward the back rows, where someone sat who made him put down 40 years of weight. Newport, Rhode Island. September 1978. A small theater with 300 seats, wood creaking under decades of performances, velvet curtains faded to a color between burgundy and rust. The kind of venue Dylan didn't play anymore. Too intimate. Too exposed. But his manager had convinced him. A benefit concert for a local music education fund, one night, in and out, nobody would make a big deal about it. Dylan had agreed because he was tired. Not physically tired. Something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying other people's expectations for so long you forget what your own voice sounds like. He'd been Bob Dylan, the Bob Dylan, for 15 years by then. The voice of a generation. The poet laureate of protest. The man who went electric and betrayed folk purists. The recluse. The born-again Christian. The sellout. The genius. The fraud. He was tired of all the names. The theater was full but quiet. These weren't screaming fans. They were middle-aged teachers, retired musicians, people who remembered when Dylan's first album came out and they were young enough to believe music could change the world. They sat in their seats with that particular stillness of people who had learned that change comes slower than songs promised. Dylan walked onto the stage alone. Just him and his acoustic guitar. No band. No backup. No buffer between himself and the room. He didn't say hello. He never did. He just sat on the wooden stool they'd left for him, adjusted the microphone, and began to play. The song was old. One of his own from 1963. The words about highways and wandering and never looking back. He'd sung it 10,000 times. The melody had worn grooves into his vocal cords. He was halfway through the second verse when he saw the man. Back row. Far right. Sitting alone in a seat that most people wouldn't choose because the sight line was bad and the pillar partially blocked the view. A man in his 60s, thin, wearing a jacket too heavy for September. Gray hair. Weathered hands resting on his knees. Dylan's fingers kept playing but his voice faltered for half a syllable. He caught himself. Kept singing. But his eyes stayed on that back row. The man wasn't moving. Wasn't singing along like some of the audience. Just sitting there with his hands on his knees, watching Dylan with an expression that was impossible to read from the stage. Dylan finished the verse. Started the third. His hands knew the chords without thinking. But something was wrong. The song felt hollow. The words that had meant something in 1963 felt like costume jewelry now, pretty but worthless, glittering but empty. He stopped playing. Not a planned pause. Not a dramatic moment. He just stopped. Mid-chord. The guitar went silent. His hands fell away from the strings. The audience waited. In a Dylan concert, silence wasn't unusual. He was known for long pauses, for making people sit in the discomfort of waiting. But this was different. This silence had weight. Dylan lowered the guitar from playing position. Held it loosely in his lap. He wasn't looking at the audience anymore. He was looking at that one man in the back row. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. The theater held its breath. 300 people watching one man have some kind of internal collapse on stage. The house manager in the back started to move toward the wings, wondering if they needed to intervene, if Dylan was having some kind of medical episode. Dylan stood up slowly. The stool scraped against the stage floor, the sound loud in the silence. He walked to the edge of the stage, still holding his guitar by the neck, letting it hang at his side. "I know you," he said. His voice rough, quiet, aimed at the back row but carried by the microphone. From before. The man in the back row didn't respond. Didn't nod. Didn't move. Just kept that same unreadable expression. "You were there," Dylan said. "In Minneapolis. 1961, at the apartment on 4th Street. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in Minneapolis in 1961. Bob Dylan, Then still Bobby Zimmerman to most people who knew him, was 20 years old, and nobody. He'd dropped out of college. He'd hitchhiked and lied and borrowed guitars and slept on couches and played coffee houses for tips that barely covered a meal. He was determined to become something, but he had no idea what or how. In Minneapolis, there was a folk music scene. Small. Intense. People who took music seriously, who believed songs could carry truth that conversation couldn't. Dylan fell into it the way water finds cracks. There was an apartment on 4th Street where musicians gathered. Whoever had a couch offered it. Whoever had food shared it. They'd play music until 3 in the morning, passing guitars, trading songs, arguing about Woody Guthrie and Lead Belly and whether authenticity mattered more than craft. A man named Thomas Webb lived there. He was older than the rest of them, 35, which seemed ancient to the kids in their early 20s. He didn't play an instrument. He didn't sing. But he listened with an intensity that made everyone want to play better, sing truer. Dylan would show up at Thomas's apartment with new songs scribbled on napkins, melodies he couldn't quite get right, lyrics that felt important but shapeless. Thomas would sit in his worn armchair, close his eyes, and listen. He never said, "Good job." He never said, "That's brilliant." What he said was, "Try it again. But slower. Let the silence do more work." Dylan, proud, defensive, convinced he knew better than everyone, would bristle. "The silence doesn't do anything. The words do the work." "No," Thomas would say, patient as water wearing down stone. "The silence is where people hear themselves. The words are just the doorway. But the silence is the room." Dylan didn't believe him. But he tried it anyway. Played slower. Let the spaces breathe. And something shifted. The songs that had felt like shouting became conversations. The words that had tried to say everything started saying just enough. For 6 months, Dylan lived in that apartment more than he lived anywhere else. Thomas taught him things that had nothing to do with music. How to make coffee without a filter. How to patch jeans with dental floss. How to recognize when someone was listening to respond versus listening to understand. "You're going to be famous," Thomas told him one night in February 1962. They were the only ones still awake. Dylan was lying on the floor with his guitar across his chest. Thomas was in his chair, smoking a cigarette that had burned down to his fingers. Dylan laughed. "Sure. Famous for being broke." "No. I mean it. You're going to be famous. Really famous. The kind where people stop seeing you and start seeing what they want you to be." "So what do I do about that?" Thomas stubbed out his cigarette. "Remember that you're just a person. That all of this." He gestured at the guitar, the scattered papers with lyrics, the romantic mythology of being a folk singer, is borrowed. You don't own it. You're just holding it for a while. And when it gets too heavy, you put it down. Dylan didn't understand what he meant. He was 20. He wanted the weight. He wanted to matter. 3 weeks later, Dylan left for New York. He was going to make it. He was going to become Bob Dylan, the name he'd chosen, the persona he'd built. He left Minneapolis and never looked back. He never said goodbye to Thomas Webb. Never wrote. Never called. Just disappeared into his own future. And now, 17 years later, Thomas Webb was sitting in the back row of a theater in Newport, Rhode Island. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Dylan stood at the edge of the stage, guitar hanging from his hand. The audience was getting uncomfortable. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was something private happening in public. "You told me to put it down when it got too heavy," Dylan said. His voice was quiet but the microphone carried it. "I never understood what you meant." Thomas Webb finally moved. He stood up slowly, the way older bodies move, careful of joints that had learned pain. He didn't walk toward the stage. He just stood there in the back row. "You were supposed to figure that out yourself," Thomas said. His voice was quieter than Dylan's, but in the silence of the theater, everyone heard him. That was the whole point. Dylan looked down at his guitar. At his hands that had played this instrument for thousands of hours, in front of millions of people, until the calluses had calluses and the muscle memory was deeper than conscious thought. I forgot how to play for myself, Dylan said. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what it felt like before everyone was listening. So stop letting them listen, Thomas said. The audience shifted. What did that mean? They'd paid for tickets. They'd come to hear Bob Dylan. He couldn't just stop. But Dylan did exactly that. He turned back to the stool, sat down, and positioned his guitar. Then he reached over and turned off his microphone. The click echoed through the theater. He started playing again. The same song he'd stopped mid-verse. But now, with the microphone off, the sound was different. Smaller. Acoustic in the truest sense, just wood and wire and air, no amplification, no technology carrying it beyond its natural range. The people in the front rows could hear him. The people in the middle had to strain. The people in the back, including Thomas Webb, could barely hear anything but the ghost of melody. Dylan sang the song the way he'd sung it in that 4th Street apartment in 1962. For himself. For the person who taught him that silence does the work. For the version of himself who hadn't yet learned to perform. Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. He played for 20 minutes. No microphone. No announcements. No acknowledgement of the audience's confusion or frustration. Some people got up and left. They'd paid to hear Bob Dylan, not to watch him have a personal moment that excluded them. Others stayed. Leaned forward. Strained to hear. And in that straining, something happened. The room became intimate in a way that amplified sound never achieves. People stopped coughing. Stopped shifting in their seats. Stopped existing as an audience, and became something more like witnesses. Thomas Webb sat back down. Closed his eyes. Listened the way he'd listened 17 years ago, with that complete attention that makes musicians want to play better. When Dylan finished the last song, he opened his eyes. The theater was maybe half full now. The people who'd stayed weren't applauding. They were just sitting in the resonance of what they'd heard. Dylan stood up. Turned his microphone back on. The click sounded like a door closing. Thank you for coming, he said. The standard closing line. Meaningless and true at the same time. He walked off stage. Didn't come back for an encore. The house lights came up. The audience filed out quietly, unsure what they'd just witnessed. Dylan went to his dressing room. A converted storage closet with a mirror and a chair. He sat down. Put his guitar in its case. And waited. 10 minutes later there was a knock. Dylan knew who it would be. Come in. Thomas Webb opened the door. Stood in the doorway. They looked at each other, the 20-year-old kid grown into a legend, and the man who'd taught him how to listen to silence. You got old, Dylan said. So did you. They both smiled. Small, real smiles that had nothing to do with performance. Why did you come? Dylan asked. I saw you were playing. I wanted to see if you remembered. Remembered what? How to put it down. Dylan looked at his guitar case. At 17 years of carrying expectations and mythology and other people's needs disguised as his own ambition. I don't know if I can, he admitted. I don't know who I am without it anymore. Thomas stepped into the room. Closed the door behind him. Then don't put all of it down. Just put down the part that isn't yours. The part you're carrying for other people. How do I know which part is which? You play without the microphone. Like you just did. And whatever still feels true, that's yours. Everything else is borrowed weight. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan and Thomas talked for 2 hours in that storage closet dressing room. About simpler things. Thomas's life. He'd become a music teacher, never famous, never wealthy, but he'd taught hundreds of kids to listen to silence. About Dylan's exhaustion carrying a generation's expectations. When they finally stood to leave, Dylan reached into his guitar case and pulled out a harmonica. An old one, dented, from 1961. "I've carried this since Minneapolis," Dylan said. "I don't even play it anymore. But I couldn't let it go." Thomas took it, turned it over in his weathered hands. "Now you can." They shook hands. Thomas left through the stage door into the September night. Dylan never saw him again. Thomas died in 1983. Dylan found out from an obituary someone mailed him. But something changed that night in Newport. Dylan started playing smaller venues again. Started turning off microphones mid-song just to remember what his voice sounded like without amplification. Started saying no to things that felt like borrowed weight. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Years later, an interviewer asked Dylan about his most important performance. Everyone expected him to say Newport 1965, or the Rolling Thunder Revue, or Madison Square Garden. "Small theater in Rhode Island," Dylan said. "1978, barely remember the songs. But I remember learning how to put down what wasn't mine." The interviewer asked what he meant. Dylan didn't explain. He never did. He just smiled and said, "The silence is where people hear themselves."